Okay, the work done on the old Fairbanks 3-horse here was in preparation for this project. This is a wheel horse frame. It's got a 6-speed manual rear end. I've gone ahead and updated the wheels. The wheels on it were pretty rough. The whole tractor was rough. The sheet metal was rusted off of it, and you know, you can tell by the amount of rust on the frame that it was pretty rough. So it's an ideal candidate to take this engine. This is the latest tractor project here. I've already sawed off the pedal shaft here and getting ready to put a different steering system in it. I'll walk around here. And here's a look at the rear end. Shifters. Here's a possible steering system for it, steering box. Don't know if I'm going to use it yet or not. Here's some other steering components I've been gathering up for it. Here's a cute little rack and pinion that is in competition for may or may not use it here. Just depends on what's easiest. I got to rework the brake system. But this will be kind of a project here. It's going to take a while. This one's going to take a while. The engine, of course, will mount here on the frame, these frame rails. And then the seat, which normally goes right here over the wheels, is going to actually be back here. I'll put a seat bracket back here, back behind the transaxle, and set back here like an old-fashioned real early tractor would be. Seat will be back up here in this area. So that's the preliminary plans. We'll see if we can make it all come together. This front axle has a broken spot on it under here. Let's see, put this wheel out here. Got a little broken spot there, so a good friend of mine gave me another axle beam for it. Stick it on there. Got some cutting to do here. I've already had the engine setting on there. Got some cutting to do to clear the mixer. These tabs here will get cut off where the marks are there. Then the mixer will nestle its way right in there. Back over to the engine. Already got the bolts out. I've had this engine sitting on there. This base will be eliminated. And I'll just set the engine on and bolt it with these bolts here. This base goes away. I thought I'd save quite a bit of weight by getting rid of that cast iron base, but it only weighs 37 pounds. So I'm not saving a whole lot of weight by getting rid of it, but it allows the engine to, the flywheels to kind of nestle down beside the frame, and makes for a little cleaner installation. So that's the overview. I'll try to give you video as we make progress on it, and more updates to come. Okay, we started out by getting the front axle off of it here, and I had to heat it quite a bit. It's still pretty hot. As you can see, it's been red hot here to get that pin out. That pin was stuck in that axle. That actually damaged this little pin that goes through the back. There's supposed to be a tab welded on that, and you put a bolt through it. I'm going to have to re-weld that. No big deal. But I've been cleaning up the other axle here, and got the holes cleaned out. Grease zerk's working again and stuff like that, so getting ready to pop it on there. So that's the first step, getting this thing going. And it pops up in here like this, fits like so. There's a bracket goes on the front here that I'm sawing off now. There's tabs to clear the mixer. So let's have a look at that job. Okay, here's the setup here in the bandsaw. I don't know if I've shown you the bandsaw or not. I've taken an old horizontal bandsaw and build a stand for it, and works out quite well. There's a picture of some of the way I've got it set up there. And it used to be a saw similar to the one I've got underneath the bench here. You've seen those types of saws. You can get them cheap. They're Chinese deals, but they work fine. But I was lucky to be able to get in here and saw this with this type of setup on this deal. There we go, pretty slick. Okay, I've got it back on its feet. So I'm going to set the engine on it. Start to get a location for the motor mounts. Alright, I got the frame off of it. Rear end there is supported by a jack, and the frame is laying on the table here. And trying to fit up this rack and pinion system. Let me show you what we got going here. Okay, this little rack, I made a bracket for it to mount it. It would nestle down in the frame here. And got to looking, and the geometry between the rack, its inner and outer tie rods, and the rocking of the axle, and the angle of the turning with it and everything, the geometry just wasn't quite right. And to top it all off, which nixed the whole project here, was the tie rod ends are too long. By the time I add the inner tie rod joint and the outer tie rod joint, the tie rod itself was too short. It wouldn't have room enough for the threads in there, so I had to nix this part of the project and resort to plan B. So here's plan B. Take this, throw it away, get the original rock shaft out of the original setup. It's going to go in here like so. The tie rods will hook here, and everybody will be happy there. The geometry will be factory. The axle can rock back and forth. The tie rod geometry will be as designed from the factory. And basically I'm going to just put an arm on here and run a rod back to the steering box and use a Cub Cadet steering box on it. Here's a close-up how it's all fit in the tractor. Of course, you're looking at everything upside down here. I did get the motor mounts on here, and I've had the motor bolted on it, so that system seems to be working. And so I'm going to probably cut this rock shaft off, right in here somewhere, and all it's going to be is just an idler shaft. When the wheels get forced to turn, these will take care of each spindle. So simple, and I've got to make a bearing back here to carry this part of the shaft here. So that's what we're doing now. I'll cut this shaft off a little bit and set a bearing in here, and to carry the back end, which would normally have been carried by the rack gear back here on the stock steering system. So over on the mill, I'm starting to cut a bearing pocket and a cross member that will go across here. And just quickly, here's the setup. I won't bore you with all the boring details of boring this hole, but basically I just used a piece of angle iron, bored a hole in it for this bearing, and that will hold the other end of the rock shaft. So we'll get it together here and get it over on the chassis. Okay, let's take a little closer look at this Ross steering gear. Again, this is out of a Cub Cadet. Got it in a vise here. And there's 2 jam nuts on here. I took those off. Let's turn it up here and take it apart. Have a look inside. Alright, before we go inside, I want to show you I made a bracket here and bolted it on. There's a couple, 3 different places to bolt the steering gear to the tractor. I chose to make a bracket here. I'll show you that later. That goes underneath the frame. So let's pull this plate off. Very, very, very simple. There's a pin right there that's adjustable, and inside here is a worm, like a worm gear. Let me get my hand out of the way. And I'm going to reach up here and turn the steering wheel shaft. You can just see that I've cleaned a lot of the grease out. I'm going to re-grease that. But all it is real simple movement there. This pin right here goes down in that gear there, and it's adjustable in and out for backlash, and to tighten the gear up. And it's very, very simple. That's all there is to it. It's got a little wear plate here that comes off of there. Got a grease zerk here. The only thing I see it does is greasing this bolt, the main bolt here that goes through the housing there. I don't think it inserts grease in here. I'm not, well, maybe it does. I have to look and see. Maybe it does, but I'm going to grease that anyway, and we'll put that back together, and I'll show you how it goes on the tractor here soon. Alright, we got it back together here. I just got it set up so I can just easily turn it here, like by hand, without steering wheel on it. And it's got a couple jam nuts there to hold it together, and got fresh lube in it. This adjustment here on that pin inside has been tightened up to where it just barely has just a little bit of perceptible play there. It's got to have a little bit, but I think that's great. I'm going to go ahead and put that back on the tractor now. Okay, and on the other end of this there'll be a drag link go here, and here's the modification that I did to the spindle. Where my hand is where the wheel goes on. This goes up through the axle. The tie rod goes from here to the other side of the tractor to the other spindle, and this is the new piece that I've added to make a steering arm. So it'll pivot like this. So that will go on the tractor next. And also I mentioned between here and that front spindle I made a drag link. I'm using standard garden tractor tie rod ends on it. This is just a piece of 5/8 rod that was put in a lathe. I put it in a lathe and turned it down and to 3/8 and threaded it. I got to put jam nuts on here yet, but that's the drag link ready to go on. Okay, I want to give you a look at the steering system here. Here's what I come up with. Here's the steering column. Come up with a bracket, set of brackets here I made up for it. And the gear on that piece of angle bolts underneath the frame rails here. And you can see it nestled down inside the frame there. And comes up here to this brace, and that's it makes it just solid as it can be. It's not going to move or go anywhere. It's got a U-bolt in it there. And I'll finish this up later with some kind of a little dash panel or something like that, but basically it's very simple. Just mounted the steering gear down between the frame rails. There's the drag link on it, and runs forward to the arm I made on the steering spindle. And of course this tie rod up here goes across to the side. Now I used the original wheel horse rock shaft here. You know, typically it came back here to a gear, and the steering came up from here in the middle of the frame. Well, I just made a cross member here and put a bearing in there, cut it for a bearing, and I used that rock shaft. Let me turn the wheels here. I used that rock shaft to tie both tie rods together at the same point. That way the steering geometry doesn't change. The only thing I've changed is put this arm on here, and it works just fine. Works very nicely. Doesn't take much effort to turn the wheels, and works out pretty well. And while we're looking, let's see, I have heated up the steering shift, or the gear shift, straightened it out, and I made a seat bracket for it. I've got an old antique Oliver cast iron seat on it. Got an original seat spring here, and just let me back up here so you can see the better picture of it. And I think it works out fine. Made a plate, bolted on top of the transaxle, welded on a couple of braces that go down to the to this pin that goes through for the hitch. Used the original hitch. That way all this will come off. This tractor is being built in a modular fashion. I'm trying to use a lot of parts that, in case I break a steering gear or something like that, I can get another one, bolt right on. I don't have to do any modifications to anything. I'm going to try to use the original brakes, and I'm going to come up with a hand linkage, hand lever for the clutch and brake. So here's the motor mounts, motor mount ears, and we'll get the motor set back in here and show you the drive system. Okay, I have the tractor partially disassembled now. I've had it mocked up and running, and I've driven the tractor, and I've got it disassembled now for the finish up the painting. First thing I did was paint the fenders, and the paint work is turned out good, I think, for the era. It's nothing fancy. The tractor's nothing fancy, but I didn't want a bright, shiny paint job, so I used a satin finish. And so let me go through the drivetrain components here. First of all, coming down from the belt here, and walk around the other side, is the belt tensioner. I built this assembly to keep tension on the main drive belt. It's spring loaded here, and from there the belt goes down to a jack shaft. Here's a close-up view of the jack shaft assembly. The pulleys go on here, and this is just a pair of bearings with some spacers in here and a mounting plate. I'll show you how that goes on next. It resides right down here on the frame rail. I've already gone ahead and put the tractor back together here, and it just transfers power from the main pulley down to the jack shaft. Okay, here it is installed on the frame. I've gone ahead and assembled the tractor at this point. So the jack shaft merely takes the power from the big main pulley on the crankshaft of the engine down to the pulley on the jack shaft. From the jack shaft pulley, this is the clutch. This lifts that belt up off of that pulley and lets you come to a stop. This is all stock wheel horse linkage, and then of course I had to add that little idler there to give me a good wrap around the pulley. So that's kind of the main drive on it. The sheet metal crank fenders for these engines are extremely expensive nowadays, so I made one, bolted it on there. It's held on with brackets. As you can see the splatter on it there, it's definitely working. Here's a little toolbox I come up with. That houses the battery. Let me walk around this side here. Here's a shot of the battery box and the ignition switch. The ignition switch, just a simple 6-volt battery in there, will run this thing for a month. And it runs the spark box here. Let me turn the switch on there. There's the electronic spark box. I've got an electronic ignition module in there that runs the spark plug, fires the plug, and it's triggered with a magnetic crank trigger. And the crank trigger is merely a magnet in the end of that bolt there. I've got bolted to the cam gear, and it comes up and goes by that sensor there, and that's what causes a spark. And this system uses very little voltage and is very reliable. Up front we've got the front bumper and a fuel tank mounted in there, and got a little oil can on it here just for lubricating the engine, so just carry that on board as well. Got a custom exhaust on it. It comes out of the head, goes down underneath and pops out back here right behind the flywheel and right in front of the rear wheel. Sounds pretty good. Got the factory belt pulley, tin belt pulley. Come around here, we've got the clutch knob, clutch lever, shift lever, 3 speeds, and then the high-low transmission shifter with custom made brass knobs. Made those on my lathe. Got a custom inlaid steering wheel hub. It's an old piston, and I inlaid that watch fob on it. So that's about it. That's an overview of the tractor. And we've got an Oliver chilled plow seat on it, which is an antique in itself, and for the most part, put a couple wheel caps on it. For the most part, that's about it. We'll show it running here in a second. I always float some boards down in here in the water, and that keeps the water from splashing out when you go over bumps and rough terrain. So anyway, I'll show you some footage of it running here. Thanks for watching the build.